They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody warns you what happens when family becomes the weapon used against you. When your own sister walks into the business you helped build and decides that everything you've touched for 12 years suddenly needs investigating. I'm Marcus Thompson, and this is the story of how nepotism nearly destroyed not just my career but the company I'd given my life to protect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You know that feeling when you walk into a place and immediately feel at home? That's what Thompson Logistics Solutions was for me. Not just because my last name was painted on the building in faded blue letters, but because I'd earned my place there one forklift load, one client call, one crisis resolution at a time. 12 years as Senior Operations Director, but really I'd been part of this company since I was 16, spending summers learning to drive the big rigs and understanding why our drivers called the warehouse their second home. Cedar Rapids isn't exactly the logistics capital of America, but we'd carved out our niche. 47 employees, most of them lifers who'd been there longer than some marriages last. Thompson Logistics wasn't just moving freight for agricultural suppliers and manufacturing companies across Iowa and Illinois. We were the bridge between the farmers who fed America and the factories that built it. Every morning at 5:30, I'd unlock the main warehouse on the east side of town, flip on those buzzing fluorescent lights, and watch our operation come to life like a well-orchestrated symphony. My father, Bob Thompson, started this company in 1987 with 2 trucks and a dream that hard work could build something lasting. By the time I graduated high school, we had 15 trucks. When I finished my logistics degree at Iowa State, we'd grown to 25. And when I officially became Senior Operations Director 5 years ago, we were running 32 trucks with a client roster that read like a who's who of Midwest agriculture and manufacturing. I didn't just know our operation, I had helped design half of it. There's something beautiful about logistics when it works right. Trucks arriving exactly when they're supposed to, warehouse staff moving with practiced efficiency, paperwork flowing seamlessly between departments. I knew every driver by name, their families, their preferred routes, which ones needed extra time for medical appointments, and which ones would volunteer for emergency runs without hesitation. Tony Richards, our warehouse supervisor, had been there since before I was born. Patty Wilson ran the office like a benevolent dictator, keeping track of every invoice, every delivery confirmation, every regulatory filing with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Our safety record was impeccable. Our on-time delivery rate consistently hit 96%. Our drivers stayed with us because we treated them like family, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. When Mike Sullivan's wife got cancer, we made sure he could take the time he needed without worrying about his paycheck. When Jordan Clark graduated college with a logistics degree but no experience, we hired him as a trainee and watched him grow into one of our most reliable coordinators. This wasn't just business, it was community, but success has a way of attracting attention, and not always the kind you want. As Dad approached his 62nd birthday, conversations about succession planning started happening more frequently around the dinner table. Mom would make her famous pot roast, and inevitably, the talk would turn to the future of the company. I'd assumed, maybe naively, that my 12 years of dedication, my intimate knowledge of every aspect of our operation, and my proven track record would speak for themselves. The clients trusted me, the employees respected me, the numbers were strong. Then Jessica came home. My sister had always been the academic star of the family, while I was getting my hands dirty in the warehouse, learning the business from the ground up. She was pursuing her MBA at the University of Iowa, graduating summa cum laude with concentrations in finance and operations management. After graduation, she'd landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm in Des Moines, specializing in operational efficiency for mid-sized companies. For 3 years, she'd been the family success story, the one who wore business suits and spoke in corporate buzzwords about synergies and optimization strategies. Jessica was smart, there was no denying that. She could analyze a profit and loss statement faster than most people could read a menu. She understood supply chain theory, regulatory compliance frameworks, and modern business systems in ways that impressed Dad's golf buddies and made Mom beam with pride at church functions. But there was something about the way she talked about our family business that always rubbed me wrong. She'd visit for holidays and immediately start pointing out areas for improvement, suggesting we needed better technology integration, more sophisticated performance metrics, modernized compliance protocols. The thing was, she wasn't necessarily wrong about some of these things. Thompson Logistics had grown organically over the decades, and some of our systems were admittedly old school. We still used paper logs for some tracking, relied heavily on personal relationships rather than formal contracts, and operated with the kind of flexibility that worked great until regulatory agencies started demanding more detailed documentation. But what Jessica saw as inefficiency, I saw as adaptability. What she called outdated, I called proven. What she viewed as compliance gaps, I knew were calculated risks that had served us well for years. The turning point came during a family barbecue last Memorial Day. Dad had invited Kevin Martinez, our operations manager and my closest ally at the company, along with his family. Kevin had started as a driver 8 years ago, worked his way up through the warehouse, and eventually became my right hand in coordinating our most complex logistics challenges. He understood the business almost as well as I did, and more importantly, he understood the culture we'd built. As we sat on Dad's back patio, watching the kids play in the yard, and listening to Mom fuss over everyone's plate, the conversation naturally drifted to business. Jessica had been asking pointed questions all afternoon about our compliance procedures, our performance tracking systems, our employee evaluation processes. I could see Kevin getting uncomfortable with the tone of her inquiries, but I figured it was just her consultant training kicking in. She was programmed to identify problems and propose solutions. Then she said something that stopped the conversation cold. "Dad, I've been thinking about your succession planning challenges, and I really think the company needs a formal compliance structure before any transition happens. You're sitting on significant regulatory exposure, and frankly, I'm concerned about some of the operational decisions being made without proper oversight." The way she said operational decisions, looking directly at me, made it clear she wasn't talking about abstract business theory. She was talking about my decisions, my 12 years of successful operational leadership, the system that had grown our revenue by 40% over the past 5 years. Dad set down his beer and leaned forward. "What kind of regulatory exposure are you talking about, Jessica?" She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through what looked like official documents, DOTO regulations, OSHA compliance requirements, State Transportation Authority filings. I've been doing
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
some research, and there are several areas where we could be vulnerable if an inspector decided to dig deep. Driver hour documentation, warehouse safety protocols, vehicle maintenance records. The informal systems that might have worked when the company was smaller don't provide the kind of documentation trail that regulators expect from a company our size. I felt my jaw tighten. Our safety record is spotless, Jessica. 0 accidents in 18 months. Our drivers consistently pass their inspections. We've never had a regulatory violation that wasn't immediately corrected. That's exactly my point, Marcus. You're managing reactively instead of proactively. Compliance isn't about fixing problems after they're identified. It's about preventing them from happening in the first place. Kevin cleared his throat diplomatically. "We've always been pretty careful about following regulations, Jessica. Marcus runs a tight ship." She smiled, but there was something sharp in it. "I'm sure you do your best with the resources you have. But good intentions aren't the same as systematic compliance management. What happens when Dad retires and potential buyers start doing due diligence? What happens if we want to pursue larger contracts that require certified compliance programs? What happens if someone gets hurt and lawyers start asking for documentation that doesn't exist in the format they expect? Dad was nodding slowly, and I could see the wheels turning. This wasn't just academic discussion for him, this was about protecting the company he'd built, ensuring its future stability. What are you suggesting? I think Thompson Logistics needs a formal compliance director position, someone who can audit our current procedures, identify gaps, implement systematic improvements, and create the kind of documentation that will protect us legally and position us for growth. The silence stretched out long enough that I could hear the neighbor's lawnmower 3 houses down. Mom was pretending to focus on clearing plates, but I could tell she was listening intently. Kevin was staring at his hands. Dad was looking back and forth between Jessica and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. And you think you'd be qualified for that kind of position? Dad asked. Jessica straightened up, and I recognized the expression from our childhood. It was the same look she'd get right before announcing she'd gotten the highest grade in her class, or won some academic competition. I have an MBA with operational focus, 3 years of consulting experience specifically in compliance and efficiency optimization, and intimate knowledge of this company's operations. I think I could bring a fresh perspective, while respecting the foundation that's already been built. That last part was directed at me, clearly intended as some kind of diplomatic gesture, but what I heard was my sister positioning herself as the solution to problems she'd just finished identifying. Problems that coincidentally all seemed to fall under my area of responsibility. Dad looked at me expectantly. What do you think, Marcus? Would having formal compliance oversight be helpful? It was a trap, and we all knew it. If I said no, I'd look like I was opposed to proper procedures and protecting the company. If I said yes, I'd be endorsing Jessica's insertion into a business where she'd have authority to question everything I'd been doing for over a decade. But there was no good way to object without sounding defensive or territorial. I think any improvements to our operations should be carefully considered, I said, choosing my words as diplomatically as possible. Our current systems have served us well, but if there are ways to strengthen our position, I'm always open to discussion. Jessica smiled again, and this time it felt genuine. That's exactly the kind of collaborative approach that would make this successful. I wouldn't want to come in and change things arbitrarily. I'd want to work with you, Marcus, to understand why our current procedures work and how we can enhance them without disrupting what's already effective. Kevin excused himself to check on his kids, but not before giving me a look that said he understood exactly what had just happened. Mom started talking about dessert options with the forced cheerfulness she used when family conversations got tense, and Dad sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who thought he might have just found an elegant solution to multiple problems. I should have objected then. Should have pointed out that Jessica's 3 years of consulting experience were all theoretical, that she'd never actually run day-to-day operations at a logistics company, that her understanding of our business came from holiday visits and MBA case studies. Should have reminded Dad that I'd been successfully managing operations for 12 years without a single major incident, that our growth and success spoke for themselves, that creating a new layer of oversight might solve problems that didn't actually exist while creating new ones that definitely would. But I didn't. Because I was Marcus Thompson, the reliable one, the team player, the son who'd never caused drama or challenged Dad's decisions, and because some naive part of me believed that Jessica genuinely wanted to help, that her consulting background might actually complement my operational experience, that we could work together to strengthen the company we both cared about. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was underestimating how quickly things would change once Jessica's position was made official. 2 weeks later, Dad called me into his office on a Wednesday morning. The space still smelled like the coffee and aftershave combination that had defined my childhood memories of visiting him at work. His desk was covered with the same organized chaos of invoices, route schedules, and client contracts that had been there for as long as I could remember. But something felt different about the conversation before it even began. "Marcus, I've been thinking about our discussion at the barbecue, and I think Jessica raised some important points about positioning the company for the future." I nodded carefully. "She definitely has some interesting perspectives. I'm going to create a new position for her, Director of Compliance and Process Improvement. She'll be responsible for auditing our current procedures, ensuring we're meeting all regulatory requirements, and implementing systems that will protect us as we continue to grow." The title alone told me everything I needed to know. Director level, which meant she'd have authority equal to mine in the organizational structure. Compliance, which meant she'd have oversight over everything I did. Process improvement, which meant she'd have mandate to change anything she deemed inadequate. That sounds like it could be helpful, I managed to say, though my throat felt tight. "I want to be clear about something, Marcus. This isn't about your performance. You've done an outstanding job running operations, and that's not going to change. But as we look toward the future, especially with succession planning, we need to make sure we have robust systems in place. Jessica's background gives her skills that complement yours perfectly." I could hear the reasoning, and objectively it even made sense, but there was something about the way Dad was explaining it that felt like he was convincing himself as much as he was informing me, like he was justifying a decision that maybe he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but felt was necessary. "When would she start?" "Next Monday. I know it's quick, but she's already given notice at her consulting firm, and honestly, I think the sooner we get started on this, the better." Next Monday. 6 days to prepare for my sister to become my equal in the company hierarchy, with explicit authority to scrutinize and potentially overhaul everything I'd built over the past 12 years. That afternoon, I called Kevin into my office and closed the door. He took one look at my expression and shook his head. "She got the job. Director of Compliance and Process Improvement. Starts Monday." Kevin sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. "You know what this means, right?" I did know, but I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. "It means we're going to have more oversight." "Marcus, come on. It means your sister is going to be looking for problems in everything you do. That's literally her job description now. Maybe it won't be that bad. Maybe she'll focus on areas that actually need improvement." Kevin gave me the look he reserved for drivers who claimed they'd definitely remembered to check their pre-trip inspections. "When's the last time you saw a consultant come into a company and report that everything was running perfectly and no changes were needed?" He had a point. Jessica's value to Dad would be directly tied to her ability to identify issues and implement improvements. If she concluded that our operations were already optimal, what would justify her position? What would demonstrate her worth to the company? But I still wanted to believe that family loyalty would matter, that her respect for what I'd built would influence her approach, that we could find ways to work together that strengthened the company without undermining the systems that had made us successful. Looking back now, I can see how naive that was. But at the time, sitting in my office with Kevin's concerned expression telling me everything I didn't want to acknowledge, I was still holding on to the hope that this would work out better than my instincts were warning me it would. I spent that weekend trying to prepare. I organized my files, updated documentation that had been on my eventual to-do list, and made sure our procedures were as clear and defensible as possible. I told myself I was being proactive, getting ready to collaborate effectively with Jessica's new role. What I was actually doing was preparing for war. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that makes Cedar Rapids look even more industrial than usual. I got to the warehouse at my normal 5:30, but instead of the familiar comfort of routine, everything felt different. Jessica's car was already in the parking lot, a silver Honda Accord that looked pristine, compared to the work trucks and weathered pickups that usually filled our employee spaces. She'd beaten me to work on her first day, which somehow felt both admirable and ominous. The main office was buzzing with an energy I hadn't felt since we'd landed the Hartley manufacturing contract 2 years ago. Patty Wilson was at her desk earlier than usual, clearly curious about how the day would unfold. Tony Richards had stuck around after the morning safety briefing instead of heading straight to the warehouse floor. Even some of the drivers who'd normally be hitting the road by 6 were lingering over coffee, stealing glances toward Dad's office, where Jessica had apparently set up camp. I found her there when I went to grab my usual cup of coffee from the break room. She'd transformed the small conference room, adjacent to Dad's office, into what looked like a command center. Her laptop was connected to a portable printer, documents were spread across the table in organized stacks, and she had a whiteboard covered with flowcharts and bullet points that I couldn't quite read from the doorway. She was wearing a navy blue pantsuit that would have looked perfectly appropriate in a Des Moines boardroom, but seemed almost comically formal in our warehouse-adjacent office space. "Good morning, Marcus," she called out when she noticed me hovering. "I was hoping to catch you early. Do you have a few minutes to talk through the schedule?" The schedule. She'd been here less than 12 hours and was already talking about schedules like she understood how our operation worked. But I forced a smile and walked into her temporary office. "Sure, what did you want to know?" Jessica gestured to a chair across from her makeshift desk. "I spent some time yesterday reviewing our standard operating procedures, and I have to say, I'm impressed by how comprehensive they are. You've clearly put a lot of thought into documenting the core processes." It felt like a compliment, but something in her tone suggested there was a but coming. I waited. "The thing is, documentation is only as good as the systems that support it. I'd like to spend this week shadowing different aspects of the operation so I can understand how theory translates to practice. Would you be comfortable having me observe your daily routines?" Shadowing. Observing. She was using diplomatic language, but what she was describing was basically following me around with a clipboard, taking notes on everything I did. The idea made my skin crawl, but I couldn't think of a reasonable way to object. "Of course, today's actually a good day for that. We've got 3 major shipments going out, a new client orientation, and I'm meeting with the state DOT inspector about our quarterly compliance review." Jessica's eyes lit up at the mention of the DOT inspector. "Perfect. That's exactly the kind of interaction I need to understand. Mind if I sit in on that meeting?" I did mind actually. The DOT inspector, a guy named Williams who'd been working our route for 6 years, had developed a comfortable working relationship with me. We'd chat about his kids' baseball games, he'd do his routine checks, we'd discuss any minor issues that came up, and he'd file his report. It was professional but relaxed, the kind of relationship that made regulatory compliance feel less like an adversarial process and more like a collaborative effort to maintain safety standards. Having Jessica there with her notebook and her fresh MBA perspective would change the entire dynamic. Williams would probably be more formal, more thorough, more focused on technical details, instead of the practical working relationship we'd built. But again, I couldn't say any of that without sounding territorial. "Sure, the meeting's at 10:30. For the next 4 hours, I felt like I was performing my own job instead of simply doing it. Jessica followed me through the morning routine with the kind of intense attention that made everyone around us nervous. When I did the daily safety walkthrough with Tony, she took notes on our informal communication style. When I reviewed the dispatch schedule with our drivers, she asked questions about how we track delivery confirmants. When I approved overtime for one of our warehouse guys whose wife had just had surgery, she inquired about our policy documentation for discretionary scheduling decisions. Every question was reasonable, every observation was technically valid, but the cumulative effect was exhausting. I found myself second-guessing decisions that I'd been making successfully for years, explaining processes that had become so automatic I'd never really thought about why they worked. The meeting with Inspector Williams was even worse than I'd anticipated. Jessica introduced herself as our new Director of Compliance, which immediately shifted Williams into his most official mode. Instead of our usual 15-minute walkthrough, he spent 45 minutes going through documentation with the kind of detail I hadn't seen since our initial certification process. He asked questions about record-keeping procedures that he'd never mentioned before. He requested copies of training logs that had always been filed, but never actually reviewed during these routine visits. Afterward, as Williams packed up his paperwork, he pulled me aside. "Everything looks good, Marcus, but you might want to make sure all your documentation is extra thorough going forward. When companies bring in compliance directors, it usually means they're preparing for growth or acquisition. That level of scrutiny means regulators pay closer attention to." The implication was clear. Jessica's presence had already changed how external agencies would view our operations. We were no longer the small, reliable family business that had earned trust through consistent performance. We were now the growing company that needed formal oversight, which meant everyone would be watching us more carefully. That afternoon, I retreated to my office to catch up on the work I'd neglected while being observed. I was reviewing driver schedules when Jessica knocked on my door. "Do you have a minute?"
Wanted to debrief about this morning? She settled into the chair across from my desk with a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. "First, I want to say that I'm really impressed by the relationships you've built. The drivers clearly respect you, the warehouse staff trust your judgment, and even the inspector obviously values the rapport you've established." Again, it sounded like a compliment, but felt like setup for criticism. However, I did notice some areas where we might want to consider process improvements. Nothing urgent, just opportunities to strengthen our position. Here it came. For example, your discretionary overtime approvals. I completely understand the reasoning behind helping Jerry with his schedule while his wife recovers, but we don't have documented criteria for those kinds of exceptions. If we ever face an employment audit, irregular scheduling could be problematic. "Jerry's been with us for 8 years, I said carefully. His wife just had major surgery. Helping him balance work and family responsibilities is the right thing to do. I'm not questioning the decision, just suggesting that we document the policy so there's consistency and legal protection. If we help Jerry but don't have clear guidelines for similar situations in the future, we could inadvertently create disparate treatment issues." She wasn't wrong. From a legal risk management perspective, having formal policies was probably smarter than relying on case-by-case judgment calls. But something about reducing Jerry's personal crisis to a documentation issue felt fundamentally wrong to me. The driver communication protocols are another area where documentation could be helpful. Jessica continued. "You and Tony have obviously developed effective informal systems, but new supervisors might not understand the nuances. Having written procedures would make training more consistent. Tony's been here since before I was born. He knows the operation better than anyone." "I'm sure he does, but what happens when Tony retires? How do we transfer that institutional knowledge to his replacement?" It was a fair question, and one that had actually been nagging at me for the past couple of years. Tony was approaching 65, and while he showed no signs of slowing down, succession planning for key positions was something we needed to address. But hearing Jessica frame it as a systemic failure rather than a future challenge felt like criticism of my long-term planning. The DOT interaction was interesting too. She went on. "Inspector Williams clearly likes working with you, which is valuable. But I noticed that some of his questions caught you off guard. Having more detailed preparation for regulatory visits might help us anticipate issues before they become problems." That one stung because it was partially true. Williams had asked about training documentation that I knew existed but couldn't immediately locate. In a normal year, that kind of minor scramble would have been forgotten by the time he left. But with Jessica watching, taking notes, it had looked like poor preparation rather than a minor oversight. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Jessica going through her observations and suggestions. Everything she said was reasonable. Her recommendations were all defensible from a business management perspective. But by the time she left my office, I felt like I'd spent the day being audited rather than doing my job. That evening, Kevin stopped by my office after most of the staff had left. "So how was day one with the new compliance director?"
I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Educational. That bad? Huh. She's not wrong about anything she's pointing out. That's what makes it so frustrating. Our informal systems work, but they're not necessarily documented the way a business consultant would expect. Our relationships with drivers and clients are strong, but they're based on trust and experience rather than written policies. Kevin sat down and crossed his arms. Marcus, can I be blunt with you? You're thinking about this wrong. This isn't about whether she's technically correct. This is about power dynamics and family politics. Your sister just got hired into a position that gives her authority to critique everything you've built here. Do you really think she's going to spend 6 months conducting an audit and then report back to your dad that everything is perfect and no changes are needed? I knew Kevin was right, but I wasn't ready to accept the implications. She said she wants to work collaboratively. Of course she did. Nobody comes into a new job announcing that they plan to make their colleagues look bad. But think about it from her perspective. She's got an MBA and consulting experience, and she's been brought in specifically to improve operations. Her value to the company depends on finding problems to solve. Her reputation depends on implementing changes that demonstrate measurable improvements. So what are you saying? I'm saying that even if she has the best intentions, her success depends on proving that the current system needs fixing. And since you built the current system, that puts you in a pretty vulnerable position. Kevin left me sitting in my office as the sun set over Cedar Rapids, thinking about organizational dynamics and family loyalty, and the difference between being right and being effective. I'd spent 12 years building an operation that worked, that served our clients well, that took care of our employees, that generated consistent profits for the family business. But none of that mattered if Jessica could demonstrate that it could work better with different systems, different procedures, different oversight. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Jessica shadowed different aspects of the operation, asked thoughtful questions, took detailed notes, and identified opportunities for improvement. She spent Tuesday with our dispatchers, learning how we coordinated routes and managed delivery schedules. She observed our warehouse operations on Wednesday, studying our inventory management and safety procedures. Thursday, she rode along with one of our senior drivers to understand the client interaction process. Each day, she'd debrief with me in the late afternoon, sharing her observations and suggestions. Each conversation was professional, collegial, and completely undermining to my confidence in the systems I'd spent years developing. The dispatch coordination is really impressive, she'd tell me, but having redundant communication channels could prevent the kind of confusion that happened with the Midwest grain delivery. The confusion she was referring to had lasted approximately 8 minutes, been resolved with a quick phone call, and resulted in zero impact to the client. But in Jessica's notes, it became a documentation gap that needed systematic correction. Your warehouse safety procedures exceed regulatory requirements, she'd observe, but the informal training approach might not be sufficient if we ever face OSHA scrutiny. Our safety training approach had produced 0 accidents in 18 months and a workforce that intuitively understood safety protocols. But in Jessica's framework, intuitive understanding wasn't sufficient documentation for regulatory purposes. By Friday, I was exhausted. Not from the physical demands of the job, but from the psychological effort of constantly justifying and explaining decisions that had never needed justification before. I felt like I was being asked to defend the success of my own operation to someone who'd never actually run a logistics company but had studied them extensively in graduate school. That afternoon, Jessica asked if we could schedule a longer debriefing session for Monday morning. I'd like to present my preliminary findings to you before I discuss anything with Dad, she said. I want to make sure I'm understanding everything correctly and that my recommendations make sense from an operational perspective. Preliminary findings. Recommendations. We'd gone from collaborative observation to formal evaluation in exactly 5 days. I spent the weekend alternating between anger and anxiety. Anger that my sister was treating my life's work like a case study to be analyzed and improved. Anxiety that her analysis might reveal genuine problems I'd been too close to see, or worse, that her recommendations would be so compelling that Dad would implement them regardless of my concerns. Sunday evening, I sat in my home office going through 12 years of operational reports, safety records, client satisfaction surveys, and financial performance data. The numbers told a clear story: revenue growth, client retention, employee stability, regulatory compliance, profit margins that had kept the company healthy through economic downturns and industry challenges. But numbers only mattered if people interpreted them correctly. And Jessica's job wasn't to validate the current system, it was to improve it. Which meant that no matter how good our performance had been, her value to the company depended on proving it could be better. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Iowa. I got to the office early, hoping to have a few minutes to prepare for Jessica's presentation. Instead, I found her already there, having apparently spent part of her weekend preparing materials that were now spread across the conference room table like evidence in a trial. "Good morning, Marcus. Thanks for making time for this. I know it's been an intense week, and I really appreciate your patience with the process." She had charts, actual charts with color coding and graphs, and what appeared to be a formal presentation outline. For someone who'd been on the job for exactly 1 week, she'd certainly been busy. "I want to start by emphasizing that this company is fundamentally sound," she began, which should have been reassuring but somehow felt ominous. "The operational performance speaks for itself. Strong financials, excellent safety record, high client satisfaction, stable workforce. Dad has every reason to be proud of what's been built here." She was leading with positives, which meant the criticism was coming. However, as I've observed the day-to-day operations, I've identified several areas where systematic improvements could strengthen our position significantly. These aren't urgent problems, but they are opportunities that become more important as the company continues to grow. Jessica walked me through what she called her operational assessment framework. She'd categorized her observations into 6 areas: regulatory compliance, process documentation, performance measurement, risk management, technology integration, and succession planning. In each category, she'd identified specific examples of what she termed informal systems that work well in practice, but lack the structural foundation necessary for sustainable growth. She'd documented gaps between our current procedures and industry best practices. She'd outlined scenarios where our relationship-based approaches might not be sufficient if we faced external scrutiny or internal transitions. The presentation was thorough, well-organized, and professionally devastating. She'd taken every strength of our operation and reframed it as a potential vulnerability. Our flexible scheduling became inconsistent policy application. Our experienced workforce became over-reliance on institutional knowledge. Our strong client relationships became insufficient contract documentation. "I want to be clear," Jessica said as she reached her conclusion. "These observations shouldn't be interpreted as criticism of current leadership or performance. The informal systems work because Marcus has built strong relationships and maintains hands-on involvement in daily operations. But sustainable growth requires systems that work regardless of who's managing them." That was the key phrase: regardless of who's managing them. Jessica wasn't just critiquing my operational procedures, she was building a case that the company's success was too dependent on my personal involvement, too vulnerable to my potential absence or departure. She was suggesting that Thompson Logistics needed systems that could function without Marcus Thompson. "What are you recommending?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Jessica flipped to her final chart, which outlined what she called a systematic improvement initiative. Formal policy documentation for all operational procedures. Digital tracking systems to replace paper-based processes. Regular performance audits conducted by someone outside the operational chain. Standardized training programs that reduce dependence on informal knowledge transfer. Contract reviews with all major clients to ensure consistent legal protections. It was a comprehensive overhaul disguised as process improvement. And it would require months of implementation, during which my time would be divided between running current operations and building new systems that would essentially replace the methods I'd developed over 12 years. "How long would something like this take to implement?" I asked. "With proper project management, I'd estimate 6 to 8 months for full deployment. Obviously, we'd phase the rollout to minimize disruption to current operations." 6 to 8 months of transition, during which Jessica would be the project manager. I would be essentially training her to systematize my job, and Dad would be evaluating whether the new systems represented an improvement over the old ones. When do you want to present this to Dad? I was hoping to schedule a meeting with both of you later this week. I'd like your input on prioritization and timeline before we move forward. She was being diplomatic, but the message was clear. This was going to happen. The only question was whether I would be a collaborative partner in restructuring my own role or a resistant obstacle to necessary improvements. I spent the rest of that Monday trying to focus on actual work while mentally preparing for a conversation with Dad that would determine the future of my career at Thompson Logistics. Jessica's analysis wasn't wrong, exactly, but it was incomplete. She'd identified technical gaps while missing the intangible strengths that made our operation successful. She'd focused on systematic vulnerabilities while ignoring the human relationships that turned potential problems into manageable challenges. But technical gaps are easier to document than relationship strengths. Systematic vulnerabilities are easier to present than intangible benefits. And Jessica's recommendations came with the authority of formal business education and consulting experience, while my objections would sound like personal defensiveness from someone who'd never worked anywhere else. That evening, I called my daughter Emma to vent about the situation. She was 16, a junior in high school, and had grown up around Thompson Logistics the way I had. She'd spent summers doing filing work and helping in the warehouse, earning spending money and learning what it meant to work in a family business. So Aunt Jessica thinks she can run the company better than you? Emma asked with the directness that only teenagers can manage. It's not that simple. She's not trying to run the company, she's trying to improve the systems. Dad, you've been complaining about work exactly twice in my entire life, once when that driver got arrested for DUI and you had to scramble to cover his routes for 3 weeks. Once when the state changed the licensing requirements and you had to retrain everyone. Now you've been stressed every day since Aunt Jessica started. Emma had a point that I'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. Jessica's first week had fundamentally changed how I felt about my job. Not because she was incompetent or malicious, but because her presence had turned my daily routine into a performance that was constantly being evaluated. The thing is, she's probably right about some of this stuff. Our systems could be more formal. Our documentation could be more thorough. From a business management perspective, her recommendations make sense. But I'm not sure that making sense from a business management perspective is the same thing as making sense for this business. We're not a case study from her MBA program. We're a family company that's worked well for 35 years by treating people like humans instead of resources to be optimized. Emma was quiet for a moment. Dad, can I ask you something? If Aunt Jessica implements all these changes, and they work the way she thinks they will, what happens to your job? That was the question I'd been avoiding. If Jessica's systematic improvements were successful, if they made the operation more efficient and more compliant and more scalable, what would be my role in the new structure? I'd built my value to the company on relationships, experience and hands-on problem solving. If those were replaced by formal systems and documented procedures, what unique contribution would I still be making? I don't know, I honestly don't know. Tuesday morning, I arrived at the office to find Jessica already meeting with Dad in his office. Through the glass wall, I could see her presenting materials from the same stack of charts she'd shown me the day before. Dad was leaning forward, asking questions, taking notes. They both looked engaged and optimistic. When the meeting ended an hour later, Dad asked me to join them. His expression was excited in a way I hadn't seen since we'd landed the Hartley contract. Marcus, Jessica's been walking me through her initial assessment, and I have to say, I'm impressed by the thoroughness of her analysis. She's identified some significant opportunities for strengthening our operational foundation. Jessica smiled at me with what appeared to be genuine warmth. I hope I represented everything accurately. I tried to emphasize that the current systems work well, but that formalizing them could provide additional security and growth potential. Dad nodded enthusiastically. What I find compelling is the proactive approach. Instead of waiting for problems or regulatory pressure, we could get ahead of these issues while we're still performing well. Build from a position of strength rather than reacting to weaknesses. It was a reasonable perspective, and one that reflected Dad's natural inclination toward careful planning and risk management. But I could also see how Jessica's presentation had reframed our stable operation as a precarious situation that needed urgent attention. "What's the timeline you're thinking about?" I asked. "Jessica suggests starting with the most critical areas and implementing changes over the next 6 to 8 months, Dad replied. "She'd manage the project while you maintain current operations, and then we'd evaluate the results and plan the next phase. 6 to 8 months, during which Jessica would be designing the future of Thompson Logistics while I kept the current version running. 6 to 8 months, during which her systematic improvements would be tested against my informal methods. 6 to 8 months, during which Dad would be comparing the daughter who was building new systems with the son who was maintaining old ones." "I think it could work well," I said, because there wasn't really any other response available. "Excellent," Dad said. "Jessica, why don't you put together a formal project plan, and we can review it next week?" As they discussed implementation details, I realized that the decision had already been made. This wasn't a consultation, it was an announcement. Jessica's preliminary assessment had become an approved initiative, and my role had shifted from operational director to transition manager for my own job restructuring. Walking back to my office, I felt something that hadn't been part of my emotional vocabulary at Thompson Logistics for 12 years. I felt like an employee rather than a leader, a participant rather than a decision maker, someone whose expertise was valued but whose judgment was no longer trusted. The formal project plan arrived in my email inbox on Thursday morning at exactly 7:15, 30 minutes before I typically started checking messages, but apparently right on schedule for Jessica's new routine. The subject line read Thompson Logistics Operational Excellence Initiative Phase 1 Implementation Plan, and the attached document was 18 pages of detailed project management methodology that looked like it belonged in a Fortune 500 boardroom rather than our family warehouse. I printed the entire thing, mostly because staring at that much corporate jargon on a screen made my eyes water, and spread it across my desk like a battle plan. Which in retrospect is exactly what it was. Jessica had divided her systematic overhaul into 3 phases, each with specific deliverables, timeline benchmarks, and success metrics. Phase 1 focused on what she called documentation and standardization of core operational procedures. Phase 2 addressed technology integration and performance measurement systems. Phase 3 tackled risk management protocols and succession planning frameworks. The language was so sanitized and professional that it took me 20 minutes of reading to understand that she was essentially planning to deconstruct and rebuild every aspect of how Thompson Logistics operated. The scope was breathtaking in its ambition. She wanted to create written procedures for processes that had evolved organically over decades. She planned to implement digital tracking systems for operations that currently relied on experience and relationship management. She intended to establish formal performance metrics for employees whose value came from qualities that couldn't easily be quantified. And she was going to do all of this while I continued running the day-to-day operations that kept our clients happy and our bills paid. But what really caught my attention wasn't the ambitious scope or the corporate language, it was the org chart on page 12. Jessica had created a visual representation of Thompson Logistics' organizational structure, both current and proposed. In the current structure, I was positioned directly below Dad, with lines connecting me to all the operational departments. Kevin reported to me. Tony reported to me. The dispatchers, the drivers, the warehouse staff, everyone who actually moved freight and served clients ultimately fell under my operational authority. In the proposed structure, Jessica had inserted herself as a parallel authority to mine. She would have direct oversight of what she termed process compliance and systematic improvement, with dotted line relationships to every department I currently supervised. The org chart showed her as having input authority over operational decisions, review authority over procedural changes, and evaluation authority over performance standards. I stared at that chart for a long time, trying to understand how someone could work for 1 week at a company and confidently redesign its entire management structure. More importantly, I tried to figure out how to object to the proposal without sounding territorial or resistant to improvement. The truth was, some of her specific suggestions were probably worthwhile. Our driver training materials hadn't been updated in 3 years. Our client contract templates were inconsistent across different account types. Our warehouse inventory tracking relied heavily on Tony's incredible memory and 20-year-old filing systems. If Jessica wanted to modernize these areas, I could support that kind of focused improvement. But her proposal went far beyond updating specific procedures. She was creating a compliance oversight structure that would give her authority to question, evaluate, and potentially override any operational decision I made. And she was doing it with Dad's enthusiastic support, using language and concepts that made her initiative sound like obvious business best practices rather than a fundamental restructuring of family company dynamics. I was still digesting the implications when Jessica knocked on my office door. "Do you
Have a few minutes to discuss the implementation plan? I wanted to get your feedback before the meeting with Dad this afternoon." She settled into the chair across from my desk with the same legal pad she'd been carrying all week, now supplemented with a tablet and what appeared to be a project management app. "I tried to be realistic about the timeline and resource requirements," she began. "I know you're incredibly busy with current operations, so I structured the phases to minimize disruption while still achieving meaningful improvements." "I noticed the organizational changes," I said, pointing to the chart that had been bothering me all morning. Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "I think that's one of the most important aspects of the plan. Right now, operational management and compliance oversight are handled by the same person, which creates potential conflicts of interest. Separating those functions should strengthen both areas." Conflicts of interest. She was suggesting that my 12 years of successful operational management had been compromised by some kind of inherent bias, that I couldn't be trusted to ensure compliance with regulations I'd been following successfully since before she finished high school. "What kind of conflicts are you concerned about?" I asked. "It's not about specific problems," Jessica replied. "It's about structural vulnerabilities. When the same person who makes operational decisions is also responsible for evaluating whether those decisions meet compliance standards, there's natural pressure to rationalize choices rather than objectively assess them." The logic was academically sound, I had to admit. From a theoretical risk management perspective, independent oversight probably was superior to self-evaluation. But we weren't a theoretical company with generic operational challenges. We were Thompson Logistics, where my operational decisions had been consistently validated by client satisfaction, regulatory approval, and financial performance for over a decade. "How would this work in practice?" I asked. "If I need to approve overtime for a driver, or adjust a delivery schedule for weather, or make exceptions for equipment maintenance, would those decisions go through compliance review?" "Not routine operational decisions," Jessica clarified, "but decisions that involve policy exceptions, regulatory implications, or resource allocation above certain thresholds would benefit from compliance consultation." Consultation. Another diplomatic word that meant someone else would have veto power over my professional judgment. "What thresholds are you thinking about?" Jessica flipped through several pages of notes. "I'm still working out the specific parameters, but probably overtime authorizations above 20% of standard hours, equipment maintenance expenses over $5,000, client contract modifications, safety protocol exceptions, and any scheduling decisions that affect regulatory compliance." I did some quick mental math. In a typical week, I made dozens of decisions that would fall into those categories. Approving overtime when drivers got delayed by weather or traffic. Authorizing emergency maintenance when equipment broke down. Adjusting delivery schedules to accommodate client needs. Making safety judgment calls based on road conditions or equipment status. These weren't policy exceptions that needed formal review. They were the routine leadership decisions that kept a logistics company running smoothly. "That seems like it would add a lot of administrative overhead to everyday operations," I said carefully. "Initially, yes, but once the processes are established and everyone understands the protocols, it should actually make operations more efficient. Clear decision-making criteria reduce uncertainty and improve consistency." Clear decision-making criteria, reduce uncertainty.
Jessica was talking about replacing judgment and experience with flowcharts and approval processes. She wanted to turn the art of managing a transportation company into a series of predetermined responses to predictable situations. The problem was that logistics work wasn't predictable. Weather changed, equipment failed, clients had emergencies, drivers got sick, road construction created delays, customer demands shifted. The reason Thompson Logistics had been successful for 35 years was that we could adapt quickly to changing circumstances, make smart decisions under pressure, and maintain strong relationships even when things didn't go according to plan. But I couldn't say that without sounding like I was opposed to structure, accountability, and professional management practices. Jessica's proposal used all the right business terminology and referenced all the appropriate management theories. My objections would sound like emotional resistance to rational improvement. I'd like to think about the implementation details, I said. When's the meeting with Dad? 3 o'clock. I'll present the overall framework, and then I was hoping you could speak to the operational feasibility. Operational feasibility. She wanted me to endorse a plan that would fundamentally alter my role at the company, using my credibility with Dad to validate her restructuring initiative. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing the proposal in detail, trying to identify specific objections that would sound reasonable rather than defensive. The problem was that Jessica had done her homework. Every recommendation was supported by business management literature. Every proposed change was framed as risk mitigation or efficiency improvement. Every criticism of current procedures was couched in language about growth potential and regulatory preparation. She'd built an intellectually compelling case for systematic change, and she'd done it by analyzing our operation through the lens of corporate best practices, rather than family business dynamics. From her perspective, Thompson Logistics was a mid-sized company that needed professional management systems. The fact that it was also a family business where relationships and trust had been more important than formal procedures wasn't part of her analytical framework. The meeting with Dad started exactly at 3, in the same conference room where Jessica had been conducting her week-long audit of my life's work. She'd prepared a presentation that was even more polished than the morning's conversation, complete with printed handouts and what appeared to be a formal business case for organizational restructuring. Dad listened intently as Jessica walked through her analysis, nodding at key points and asking occasional questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. He seemed particularly interested in the compliance oversight aspects, especially after she mentioned potential regulatory risks that could affect our licensing or insurance coverage. The goal isn't to slow down operations, Jessica explained. It's to create systems that allow us to move faster with greater confidence. When everyone understands the procedures and criteria, decision-making actually becomes more efficient. Makes sense, Dad replied. Marcus, what's your take on the feasibility? This was the moment I'd been dreading all morning. Jessica was looking at me expectantly. Dad was waiting for my professional assessment, and I had to decide whether to support a plan that would diminish my authority while potentially strengthening the company, or object to changes that might genuinely be beneficial just because they threatened my position. The analysis is thorough, I began, buying time while I figured out how to proceed. Jessica's identified areas where more formal procedures could be helpful, especially as we continue to grow. Both of them seemed to relax slightly, probably interpreting my opening as endorsement. I do have some concerns about the implementation timeline and the practical impact on daily operations. Some of the oversight procedures might create bottlenecks during busy periods or emergency situations. That's exactly why I structured the rollout in phases, Jessica responded. We'll start with the most straightforward documentation projects and gradually introduce the review processes as everyone gets comfortable with the new systems. What kind of bottlenecks are you worried about? Dad asked. This was where it got tricky. I needed to raise legitimate operational concerns without sounding like I was protecting my turf. For example, the overtime authorization thresholds. In logistics, we often have to make quick decisions about driver schedules based on weather, traffic, client emergencies, equipment problems. If those decisions need compliance review, it could delay responses when clients are counting on flexibility. Jessica had anticipated this objection. That's why I included emergency exception procedures in the plan. Urgent operational decisions can be made immediately and reviewed afterward to ensure they align with policy standards. Reviewed afterward, which meant that even my emergency decisions would be subject to Jessica's evaluation, with potential criticism if she determined that I'd exercised poor judgment under pressure. What about the technology integration aspects? Dad asked. How disruptive will that be? Minimal disruption, Jessica assured him. Most of the digital systems will run parallel to current processes initially. We'll gradually transition as people get comfortable with the new tools. We spent another 30 minutes discussing specific aspects of the implementation plan. Jessica had answers for every question, solutions for every concern, and references to industry best practices for every recommendation. By the end of the meeting, Dad was clearly convinced that her systematic approach represented a smart investment in the company's future. I think we should move forward with Phase 1, he announced. Jessica, can you start on the documentation projects next week? Absolutely. I'll begin with the driver training materials and the client contract templates. Those are foundational pieces that will inform the other procedural development. As the meeting concluded, I realized that my role had fundamentally shifted without anyone explicitly acknowledging the change. I was no longer the senior operational authority at Thompson Logistics. I was now the operational manager working under Jessica's compliance oversight, subject to her process evaluations and procedural recommendations. That evening, I stopped by Kevin's office before heading home. He was finishing up some dispatch schedules, but looked up when I knocked on his doorframe. How'd the meeting go? Jessica's project got approved. She starts Phase 1 next week. Kevin leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. What does that mean for day-to-day operations? It means that a lot of the decisions we make routinely are going to need compliance review, overtime approvals, maintenance authorizations, client exceptions, schedule modifications. Jessica will have input authority on anything she considers a policy matter, which is basically everything. Pretty much. Kevin was quiet for a moment, and I could see him working through the implications. Marcus, can I ask you something? Do you think this is really about improving operations, or is this about positioning Jessica for bigger responsibilities in the company? It was the question I'd been avoiding all week, partly because I didn't want to seem paranoid, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. I think Jessica genuinely believes her recommendations will improve the company, but I also think she's building a case for why the company needs her expertise on an ongoing basis. And if she's successful, if her systematic approaches work better than our current methods, then she becomes the operational authority and I become the guy who implements her systems. Kevin nodded slowly. You know what this reminds me of? When Hartley Manufacturing brought in that efficiency consultant 3 years ago. He spent 6 months analyzing their production processes, identified all kinds of improvements, got everyone excited about optimization and cost savings. What happened? 2 years later, he was running their operations and half the original management team was gone. Not fired, exactly, just gradually reassigned to less important roles as his systems proved more effective than their experience. I'd heard similar stories from other family businesses in the area. Well-meaning companies that brought in professional management consultants, implemented systematic improvements, and eventually found themselves run by the consultants rather than the families who'd built them. It was probably more efficient, possibly more profitable, and definitely more professionally managed. But it wasn't really a family business anymore. The thing is, Kevin, I'm not sure that would necessarily be bad for Thompson Logistics. If Jessica's approaches work, if they make us more competitive and more profitable, isn't that what matters? Kevin gave me a look that suggested I was missing something obvious. Marcus, your family built this company over 35 years. Your dad turned 2 trucks into a multi-million-dollar operation. You've grown the business by 40% in 5 years while maintaining safety standards and employee loyalty that our competitors can't match. Are you really ready to conclude that all of that experience is less valuable than someone's MBA and 3 years of consulting? When he put it that way, it sounded absurd. But Jessica's presentation had been convincing because it wasn't dismissing our experience, it was building on it. She wasn't suggesting that our current operation was failing, she was arguing that it could be more successful with better systems. And from a business management perspective, she was probably right. The problem was that business management perspective wasn't the only lens through which to evaluate Thompson Logistics. We were also a family business, a community employer, a company that had survived economic downturns and industry changes by adapting quickly and maintaining strong relationships. Those qualities were harder to systematize, more difficult to document, and potentially incompatible with the kind of formal oversight that Jessica was proposing. But I couldn't make those arguments without sounding like I was opposed to progress, resistant to accountability, or threatened by professional management practices. Jessica had framed the conversation in terms that made her systematic approach seem obviously superior to informal methods, regardless of how successful those informal methods had been. Over the weekend, I found myself driving past the warehouse at odd times, not because I needed to check on anything, but because I was trying to figure out how I felt about the changes that were coming. The building looked the same, the trucks were parked in their usual spots, the security lights cast the same familiar shadows across the loading dock. But something fundamental was shifting in my relationship to the place that had defined my adult identity. On Sunday evening, I sat in my home office with a legal pad, trying to articulate my concerns in a way that would sound reasonable to Dad if the conversation ever came up. I wrote down phrases like operational flexibility and relationship management and institutional knowledge, but everything sounded vague compared to Jessica's specific recommendations about documentation standards and compliance protocols. The truth was that my objections weren't really about business management theory. They were about the fact that my sister had spent 1 week observing an operation I'd spent 12 years building, and had concluded that it needed comprehensive restructuring under her oversight. They were about the reality that her success would be measured by her ability to improve systems that were already working well, which meant finding problems that needed solving regardless of whether they were actually problems. They were about the growing suspicion that Jessica's compliance initiative was really a succession planning strategy designed to demonstrate her qualifications for operational leadership by systematically replacing my informal methods with her formal systems. And they were about the uncomfortable realization that this strategy might actually work because she was better at presenting business cases than I was at defending relationship-based management approaches. Monday morning arrived with the first real cold snap of the season, and I could see my breath as I unlocked the warehouse doors. By the time I got to my office, Jessica was already there, with boxes of materials that suggested she'd spent the weekend preparing for Phase 1 implementation. "Good morning, Marcus. I wanted to catch you before things get busy. I've started working on the driver training documentation, and I have some questions about current procedures." She had a clipboard with what appeared to be an interview questionnaire, and I realized that the audit phase wasn't over. She was still gathering information, still analyzing processes, still building the case for systematic changes that would reshape how Thompson Logistics operated. "Sure," I said, settling into my chair, and wondering how many more mornings would start with Jessica asking questions about methods I'd developed and decisions I'd made over the past decade. "I'm trying to understand the criteria you use for route assignments. Looking at the dispatch records, it seems like there's significant variation in how drivers are matched with specific clients or geographic areas. Route assignments, something I did intuitively based on driver preferences, client relationships, equipment requirements, and geographic efficiency. Something that took into account personality matches, family schedules, and the dozen other human factors that made the difference between adequate service and exceptional performance. It depends on several factors," I began, and then spent the next 20 minutes trying to explain the art of logistics management to someone who wanted to turn it into a science. This was going to be a long week. The breaking point came 3 months into Jessica's systematic overhaul, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but ended with me questioning everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and business ethics. I arrived at the warehouse to find Jessica's car already in the parking lot, which had become routine since she'd begun what she called early morning operational assessments. What wasn't routine was the Iowa Department of Transportation vehicle parked next to it, and the sight of Inspector Williams walking around our loading dock with a clipboard and a very serious expression. Inside, I found Jessica in animated conversation with Williams and another DOT official I didn't recognize. They were reviewing a stack of documentation that looked suspiciously like the driver logs and maintenance records that Jessica had been updating as part of her Phase 2 implementation. "Marcus," Jessica called out when she saw me. "Perfect timing, could you join us for a moment?" The tone was professional, but something in her expression made my stomach tighten. Williams nodded at me with the kind of formal courtesy he'd adopted since Jessica's arrival, completely different from the easy working relationship we'd maintained for 6 years. "Mr. Thompson," the unfamiliar inspector said, introducing himself as Regional Supervisor Bradford. "We're conducting a comprehensive audit of your compliance documentation. Miss Thompson has been very helpful in providing access to your records." Miss Thompson, not Jessica, not the compliance director, but the formal designation that emphasized her authority to speak for the company. And comprehensive audit, not the routine quarterly review that Williams usually conducted. "Is there a specific concern?" I asked, looking between the three of them. Bradford consulted his clipboard. "We've identified several discrepancies in your driver hour logs, maintenance scheduling, and equipment inspection records. Nothing that appears intentionally deceptive, but significant enough to warrant detailed review." Discrepancies. The word hit me like cold water. In 12 years of managing Thompson Logistics operations, we'd never had discrepancies significant enough to trigger a comprehensive audit. Our record keeping might have been informal, but it had been accurate and complete. "What kind of discrepancies?" I asked. Jessica stepped forward with a folder of documents. "During the documentation standardization process, I discovered some inconsistencies between our internal logs and the records that would typically be provided for regulatory review. Driver hour calculations that didn't account for all break periods, maintenance schedules that showed different dates in different tracking systems, safety inspection records that were complete but filed in ways that made them difficult to correlate with vehicle assignments." She was speaking in the careful language of someone who'd rehearsed this explanation, hitting all the key points without directly accusing anyone of intentional violations. But the implication was clear: my record-keeping system had been inadequate, and only Jessica's systematic review had identified problems that could have exposed the company to regulatory penalties. "Can you show me specifically what you found?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. For the next hour, Jessica walked me through a detailed analysis of what she characterized as systematic documentation gaps in our operational records. Driver logs that showed minor discrepancies between handwritten notes and digital summaries. Maintenance records that were complete but organized chronologically rather than by vehicle. Safety inspections that had been conducted properly but filed in ways that didn't match DOT's preferred formatting standards. Each individual issue was minor, the kind of administrative variance that had never caused problems during Williams' routine inspections. But taken together, Jessica had compiled a pattern of informal record-keeping that looked sloppy when presented through the lens of systematic compliance analysis. The most damaging revelation came when Bradford asked about our overtime calculation procedures. Jessica produced a spreadsheet showing instances where drivers had worked longer hours than what was reflected in the summary reports I provided for regulatory review. "These aren't intentional underreporting," Jessica explained diplomatically. "The hours were tracked accurately in the daily logs. But the transfer to summary reports sometimes rounded down to the nearest quarter hour, which created small discrepancies that could be interpreted as compliance violations." Could be interpreted. Jessica was using conditional language, but Bradford was taking notes like he was documenting actual violations. And Williams, who had never questioned our overtime reporting in 6 years of inspections, was now reviewing every calculation with the scrutiny of someone who'd been told to look for problems. What's the timeline for correcting these issues? Bradford asked. We've already implemented new tracking systems that should prevent future discrepancies, Jessica replied. All current records are being updated to meet full compliance standards, and we're conducting training to ensure consistent application of the new procedures. We've implemented. She was speaking as if she'd been running Thompson Logistics operations for years rather than months, taking credit for fixing problems that hadn't existed until she'd applied academic compliance standards to practical business operations. After the inspectors left, promising to return next week for follow-up verification, I found myself alone with Jessica in the conference room that had become her de facto headquarters. Why didn't you discuss these issues with me before involving the DOT? I asked. Jessica looked genuinely surprised by the question. Marcus, I did discuss them. I've been presenting compliance findings in our weekly briefings for the past
month. I thought you understood that some of these discrepancies would require regulatory notification. She had mentioned compliance findings in our briefings, but always in the context of process improvements and systematic upgrades. She'd never said anything about discrepancies significant enough to trigger state-level audits or regulatory investigations. There's a difference between process improvements and compliance violations, I said. What happened today looked like the second. I understand your concern, but from a liability management perspective, proactive disclosure is always preferable to reactive explanation. If these discrepancies had been discovered during a random audit, the regulatory response would have been much more severe. Proactive disclosure. Liability management. She was using consultant terminology to justify what felt like a deliberate sabotage of my professional reputation. She'd taken minor administrative variations and escalated them into regulatory issues that made me look incompetent and potentially dishonest. Jessica, in 6 years of inspections, Williams never identified any of these issues as problems. Our safety record is spotless. Our compliance has been consistently rated as satisfactory or better. Why are these suddenly violations that need state-level investigation? She opened her laptop and pulled up what appeared to be a detailed compliance analysis. Because regulatory standards have evolved, Marcus, what was acceptable 5 years ago isn't necessarily sufficient today. The transportation industry is facing increased scrutiny, and companies that don't adapt to higher standards are becoming vulnerable to penalties that could threaten their operating licenses. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't address the fundamental question of timing. If regulatory standards had evolved, if our current practices were inadequate, if proactive disclosure was necessary to prevent more serious consequences, why had Jessica waited 3 months to raise these concerns? Why had she spent weeks conducting detailed analysis before informing me that our record keeping was potentially non-compliant? The answer became clear that afternoon when Dad called me into his office for what he described as an operational status meeting. Jessica was already there with another stack of charts and what appeared to be a comprehensive presentation about regulatory compliance and risk management. Marcus, Jessica's been briefing me on the DOT audit and the compliance improvements that need to be implemented. I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about next steps. Dad was talking like the audit was an inevitable consequence of operational deficiencies rather than the result of Jessica's decision to escalate administrative variations into regulatory issues. From what I understand, Dad continued, we've been operating with informal systems that worked well in practice but didn't meet current documentation standards. Jessica's systematic review identified these gaps before they became serious problems. Jessica nodded gravely. The timing was fortunate. If these discrepancies had been discovered during an unscheduled inspection, we could have faced significant penalties. As it stands, the DOT appreciates our proactive approach and willingness to implement corrective measures. Our proactive approach. She was taking credit for preventing problems that she'd created by applying rigid compliance standards to flexible operational practices. What kind of corrective measures are we talking about? I asked. Jessica flipped through her presentation materials.
Complete digitization of all tracking systems, real-time compliance monitoring for driver hours and equipment status, formal audit procedures conducted monthly rather than quarterly, and expanded documentation requirements for all operational decisions that involve regulatory considerations. Real-time compliance monitoring, monthly audits, expanded documentation requirements. She was describing a complete transformation of how Thompson Logistics operated, justified by compliance issues that hadn't existed until she'd identified them through academic analysis rather than practical experience. How long will implementation take? Dad asked. With proper project management, approximately 4 months for full deployment. The critical systems need to be operational within 6 weeks to satisfy the DOT's follow-up requirements. 4 months of transition during which Jessica would be designing and implementing new operational systems while I managed current responsibilities under increased regulatory scrutiny. 4 months during which her systematic improvements would be tested against my informal methods under conditions she'd created specifically to demonstrate the superiority of her approach. What about the cost? Dad inquired. The compliance software and training programs will require significant upfront investment, but the long-term liability protection and operational efficiency gains should provide positive return within 18 months. Significant upfront investment. Positive return. Jessica was speaking the language of business justification, making her compliance initiative sound like a profitable investment rather than an expensive solution to problems that might not have needed solving. After the meeting, I sat in my office trying to process what had just happened. Jessica had spent 3 months analyzing our operational practices, identified administrative variations that could be interpreted as compliance gaps, escalated those gaps into regulatory issues that required state-level investigation, and then positioned herself as the solution to problems that hadn't existed until she'd defined them as problems. It was brilliant, in a way. She'd used her compliance expertise to create a crisis that only her systematic approach could solve, demonstrating her value to the company while simultaneously undermining confidence in my operational management. And she'd done it using professional methodology and regulatory justification that made any objection sound like resistance to necessary improvements. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about improving Thompson Logistics operations. This was about Jessica establishing herself as the indispensable authority on how the company should be run, using compliance and risk management as leverage to reshape the organizational structure with herself at the center. That evening, I called Kevin and asked him to meet me at Murphy's Place, the diner where we'd sometimes grab lunch when we needed to discuss sensitive company matters away from the office. He arrived looking as frustrated as I felt. "Did you know about the DOT audit?" I asked without preamble. I knew Jessica had been asking a lot of questions about our record keeping, but no, I had no idea she was planning to involve state inspectors. Did any of the drivers mention problems with their hour logs, any complaints about overtime calculations or equipment documentation? Kevin shook his head. Nothing. The guys are actually confused about why everything's being changed. Mike Sullivan asked me yesterday if we were in some kind of regulatory trouble because Jessica keeps asking about safety procedures that we've been following successfully for years. What's the mood in the warehouse? Tense. People don't understand why systems that have worked fine suddenly need complete overhaul. Tony's particularly frustrated because Jessica keeps questioning procedures that he's been managing successfully since before she was born. I ordered coffee and tried to organize my thoughts. "Kevin, I need to ask you something and I want an honest answer. Do you think our record-keeping and compliance procedures have been adequate?" He considered the question seriously. "Marcus, in 8 years here we've never had a safety incident that wasn't handled properly. We've never failed a regulatory inspection. We've never had client complaints about service quality or reliability. Our informal systems work because they're based on experience and judgment rather than bureaucratic procedures. But could they be better? Could more formal documentation and systematic monitoring improve our operations? Probably sure. Most things can be improved with enough time and money. But the question isn't whether Jessica's systems might be technically superior. The question is whether the benefits justify the costs and whether the changes address actual problems or just theoretical vulnerabilities. That was the heart of it. Jessica had identified theoretical vulnerabilities in our operational practices and escalated them into actual regulatory concerns, creating a situation where her systematic solutions became necessary regardless of whether they addressed real problems. The timing bothers me, I admitted. Why wait 3 months to raise compliance concerns? Why not discuss these issues with me before involving external agencies? Kevin gave me a knowing look, because if she discussed them with you first, you might have addressed them through minor adjustments rather than systematic overhaul. She needed the problems to be significant enough to justify comprehensive changes. You really think this was planned? Marcus, your sister spent 3 years as a management consultant. Her job was identifying organizational inefficiencies and implementing systematic improvements. She's applying exactly the same methodology here that she used with clients, except this time the client is your family's business and the inefficiencies she's identified happen to be in areas you manage. I sat with that assessment for a while, watching the evening traffic pass by Murphy's front window. Jessica wasn't being malicious or deliberately deceptive. She was being professional, applying proven consulting techniques to improve organizational performance. The fact that her improvements required diminishing my operational authority wasn't personal. It was simply the logical consequence of replacing informal systems with formal structures. But understanding her methodology didn't make the results any less devastating to my position at Thompson Logistics. She demonstrated that my 12 years of operational experience weren't sufficient to ensure regulatory compliance by current standards. She'd shown that my relationship-based management approach created vulnerabilities that only systematic oversight could address. And she'd done it in ways that made her expertise essential to the company's future success. What are you going to do? Kevin asked. I don't know. Object to changes that might genuinely improve the company. Resist systematic improvements because they threaten my ego. Challenge my sister's qualifications when she's probably more educated about business management than I am. Or you could recognize that this isn't really about business management. It's about family dynamics and power structures and whether Thompson Logistics is going to remain a family business or become a professionally managed company that happens to be owned by your family. Kevin had articulated the choice I'd been avoiding. Jessica's systematic improvements might make Thompson Logistics more efficient, more compliant, and more profitable. But they would also make it less personal, less flexible, and less dependent on the kind of relationship-based management that had defined our company culture for 35 years. The question wasn't whether her changes would be beneficial from a business management perspective. The question was whether those benefits were worth transforming Thompson Logistics into something fundamentally different from what my father had built and what I'd spent 12 years helping to grow. 2 weeks later, I made my decision. I requested a private meeting with Dad, not in his office where Jessica might interrupt or overhear, but at his house on a Saturday morning when the rest of the family would be busy with weekend activities. I'd spent days preparing for the conversation, organizing my thoughts and anticipating his questions. Dad, I need to talk to you about the direction of the company and my role in it. He poured coffee and settled into his favorite chair with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. I know you've been struggling with some of the changes Jessica's implementing, he said. I can see the tension and I understand why this transition has been difficult for you. It's not about the transition being difficult, it's about whether the changes are necessary and whether they're compatible with the kind of company Thompson Logistics has always been. I spent the next hour explaining my concerns about Jessica's methodology, her escalation of minor administrative variations into regulatory crises, and her systematic replacement of relationship-based management with formal oversight structures. I outlined the costs of her improvements, both financial and cultural, and questioned whether the benefits justified transforming our operational approach so dramatically. Dad listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting me present my case. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes before responding. Marcus, I appreciate your perspective and I understand your concerns. But I have to tell you that from my position, Jessica's systematic approach addresses vulnerabilities that I've been worried about for years. What vulnerabilities? Succession planning, primarily. You've built incredible institutional knowledge and strong relationships. But what happens when you're not there? What happens if you get sick, or decide to pursue other opportunities, or want to reduce your involvement as you get older? Jessica's systems create documentation and procedures that protect the company regardless of personnel changes. It was a fair point, and one that I hadn't adequately considered. My operational expertise was valuable precisely because it was personal and experiential, but that also made it difficult to transfer or replace. The regulatory compliance issues are real too, Dad continued. Maybe they weren't problems 5 years ago, but the transportation industry is changing. Larger clients are requiring more detailed documentation. Insurance companies are demanding more systematic risk management. The informal approaches that worked when we were smaller don't necessarily scale as we continue to grow. So you think Jessica's changes are necessary? I think they're probably inevitable. If we don't implement them voluntarily, we'll eventually be forced to implement them by regulatory pressure or competitive requirements. Jessica's giving us the opportunity to get ahead of those pressures rather than reacting to them. Dad paused, then added something that surprised me. But I also think there's room for both approaches. Jessica's systematic expertise and your operational experience complement each other. The ideal situation isn't choosing between them. It's finding ways to integrate them effectively. What does that look like in practice? I'm not sure yet, but I think it starts with recognizing that the company is changing, and that change creates opportunities as well as challenges. Your role might be different than it was 5 years ago, but it doesn't have to be less important. We talked for another hour about potential organizational structures that could leverage both Jessica's systematic approach and my operational experience. Dad suggested that my deep understanding of client relationships and driver management might be valuable in business development roles that Jessica's compliance focus couldn't address. He mentioned expansion opportunities that would require exactly the kind of practical logistics expertise that I'd developed over 12 years. By the time I left his house, I had a different perspective on the situation. Jessica's systematic improvements weren't necessarily a threat to my value at Thompson Logistics, they were a change in how that value could be applied. Instead of fighting her compliance initiative, I could focus on areas where relationship-based management remained irreplaceable. Monday morning, I asked Jessica to meet with me in the conference room that had become the center of her organizational transformation. I've been thinking about the compliance implementation and how we can make it work more effectively. I began. She looked cautiously optimistic. I'm always open to suggestions. What if we divided operational oversight more strategically? You focus on systematic compliance, documentation, and regulatory management. I focus on client relationships, driver coordination, and emergency response situations. We collaborate on decisions that affect both areas, but we each have clear authority in our respective domains. Jessica considered the proposal. That could work. It would actually align well with the organizational structure I've been developing. Compliance oversight and operational management serve different functions, but they need to coordinate closely. I'd also like to be more involved in business development. My relationships with clients and understanding of their logistics challenges might be valuable for expansion planning. Definitely. I've been so focused on internal systems that I haven't spent much time on growth strategy. Your client experience would be essential for that. We spent the morning outlining a collaborative approach that recognized both of our areas of expertise while acknowledging the changing requirements of running Thompson Logistics. It wasn't the same role I'd held for 12 years, but it was a meaningful position that utilized my experience while accommodating Jessica's systematic improvements. 3 months later, the new organizational structure was working better than either of us had expected. Jessica's compliance systems had not only satisfied the DOT's follow-up requirements but had also positioned us to pursue larger contracts that required certified documentation standards. My focus on client relationships and business development had identified expansion opportunities that leveraged our enhanced operational capabilities. The company was different, more formal and systematically managed than it had been when I was the sole operational authority. But it was also more robust, better positioned for growth, and surprisingly more interesting to work for. Jessica's systematic approach had freed me from administrative responsibilities that I'd never particularly enjoyed, allowing me to focus on strategic challenges and relationship management that better matched my natural strengths. Most importantly, Thompson Logistics remained a family business, just one that had evolved to meet changing industry requirements while preserving the core values that had made it successful for 35 years. 6 months after Jessica's compliance initiative began, we landed the largest contract in company history, a multi-year agreement with a regional manufacturing consortium that required exactly the kind of systematic documentation and operational flexibility that our new structure provided. Jessica's compliance systems satisfied their regulatory requirements while my relationships and operational experience convinced them that we could deliver the reliable service they needed. Standing in the warehouse on the morning we signed the contract, watching our drivers prepare for routes that would generate more revenue than we'd ever handled before, I realized that family businesses don't survive by staying the same. They survive by adapting to changing circumstances while preserving the relationships and values that define their identity. Jessica's systematic improvements had challenged my assumptions about operational management and forced me to articulate what was truly valuable about relationship-based leadership. But they'd also created opportunities for growth and development that wouldn't have been possible with informal systems alone. The tension between systematic efficiency and personal relationships hadn't been resolved, it had been balanced. And that balance, uncomfortable as it sometimes was, had made Thompson Logistics stronger than either approach could have achieved alone. Sometimes the best way to preserve what matters most is to let everything else change around it. The call came on a Thursday evening in late November, just as I was finishing dinner with Emma and reviewing her college application essays. The voice on the other end belonged to Frank Morrison, one of Dad's longtime friends who served on Thompson Logistics' informal advisory board. "Marcus, I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to give you a heads up about something that's been brought to my attention." Frank's tone had the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could be either very good or very bad depending on your perspective. "What's going on, Frank?" "Your father asked me to review some financial projections and organizational charts that Jessica prepared. Apparently she's been developing what she calls a comprehensive succession planning frameworks for the company." My stomach dropped. Succession planning framework. Jessica had moved beyond operational improvements and compliance systems into territory that would determine the future leadership structure of Thompson Logistics. Did Dad mention anything specific about the timeline or his intentions? "Not directly, but Marcus, I think you should know that Jessica's proposal includes some significant changes to the management hierarchy. Changes that would affect your position in ways you might want to discuss with your father sooner rather than later." After Frank hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at Emma's college essays, thinking about how succession planning had always been this abstract future consideration rather than an immediate reality. Dad was 62, healthy, energetic, and showed no signs of wanting to retire anytime soon. But apparently Jessica had decided that waiting for natural succession timing wasn't the most strategic approach. I called Kevin and asked him to meet me early the next morning before the regular shift started. We sat in his office with coffee and the kind of grim expressions that had become too familiar over the past 6 months. "Did you know Jessica was working on succession planning?" I asked without preamble. Kevin's expression confirmed that he'd heard something. Patty mentioned that Jessica had been asking questions about long-term financial projections and organizational capacity. But I figured it was just part of her systematic approach to everything. "Frank Morrison called me last night. Apparently Dad asked him to review some kind of comprehensive framework that Jessica developed." "What does that mean for your position?" "I don't know yet. but Frank seemed to think it was significant enough to warrant a warning call. We spent the next hour speculating about what Jessica's succession framework might include, based on her approach to operational improvements over the past months. If her pattern held consistent, she would have identified vulnerabilities in the current leadership structure, proposed systematic solutions that positioned her expertise as essential, and presented the whole package as necessary preparation for the company's future stability. The difference was that succession planning wasn't about operational procedures or compliance systems. It was about who would inherit control of Thompson Logistics when Dad eventually stepped back, and what qualifications would determine that inheritance. And in that conversation, Jessica's MBA and systematic management experience might carry more weight than my 12 years of hands-on operational leadership. Later that morning, Dad asked me to join him and Jessica for what he described as a strategic planning session. I found them in the main conference room with materials spread across the table that looked like they'd been prepared for a board presentation rather than a family discussion. Jessica had charts showing Thompson Logistics' growth trajectory over the past decade, financial projections for various expansion scenarios,
and organizational diagrams that mapped current responsibilities against what she termed optimal management structures for sustained growth. Everything was professional, detailed, and clearly designed to support specific recommendations about the company's future direction. "Marcus," Dad began, "Jessica's been working on some long-term planning scenarios that I wanted to share with you. As we look toward the next phase of the company's development, I think it's important that we're all aligned on strategic priorities." Strategic priorities. Dad was using the kind of formal language that usually indicated he'd already made decisions and was now seeking buy-in rather than input. Jessica opened what appeared to be a comprehensive presentation. "I've been analyzing Thompson Logistics' position in the regional market and our potential for expansion over the next 5 to 10 years. The opportunities are significant, but they'll require organizational capabilities that are different from what we needed when the company was smaller." She walked through market analysis showing increasing demand for logistics services among agricultural and manufacturing clients, regulatory trends that favored companies with systematic compliance programs, and competitive landscape changes that rewarded operational scale and systematic efficiency over personal relationships and informal flexibility. Based on this analysis, Jessica continued, "I've developed recommendations for positioning Thompson Logistics to capitalize on these opportunities while maintaining the family business culture that's been central to our success." The recommendations were comprehensive and professionally presented. Expansion into 3 new geographic markets over the next 2 years. Investment in advanced tracking and fleet management technology. Development of specialized service offerings for high-value agricultural and manufacturing clients. Creation of formal management training programs to support operational scaling. All of it made business sense. All of it reflected sound strategic planning and careful market analysis. And all of it would require the kind of systematic management capabilities that Jessica possessed and that I'd never developed. The organizational structure recommendations are particularly important, Dad said, indicating a chart that showed proposed leadership roles for the expanded company. Jessica's organizational diagram showed Thompson Logistics evolving from a family operation with informal management hierarchies into a professionally structured company with clearly defined departmental authorities and systematic oversight mechanisms. In her proposed structure, she would serve as Chief Operating Officer, responsible for systematic compliance, process management, and operational scaling. I would become Director of Client Relations and Business Development, focusing on relationship management and market expansion. It wasn't a demotion exactly. The role she'd outlined for me was important and would utilize my experience with clients and understanding of logistics challenges. But it was also clearly secondary to her systematic oversight of operational management, and it represented a fundamental shift from my current position as the primary operational authority at Thompson Logistics. "What's the timeline for implementing these changes?" I asked. "That's what we wanted to discuss with you," Dad replied.
Jessica suggests a phased transition over the next 18 months, with the organizational changes happening gradually as we implement the expansion initiatives. 18 months. Jessica was proposing to reshape Thompson Logistics' management structure, expand into new markets, and position herself as the primary operational authority, all while I transitioned from my current role to a business development position that would be important but subordinate to her systematic oversight. I'd like some time to review the materials and consider the implications, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Of course, Jessica responded. This is a significant transition for everyone, and I want to make sure we address any concerns or questions you have. That afternoon, I sat in my office with Jessica's strategic planning materials spread across my desk, trying to process what had just happened. She'd spent 6 months implementing operational improvements that demonstrated the superiority of systematic management over informal approaches. Now she was leveraging that foundation to propose succession planning that would make her the primary operational authority while transitioning me into a supporting role. The strategy was brilliant and probably inevitable. Jessica had identified the trajectory that Thompson Logistics needed to follow to remain competitive, and she'd positioned herself as uniquely qualified to manage that trajectory. Her systematic approach, regulatory expertise, and strategic planning capabilities were exactly what the company would need to successfully expand and scale operations. But her proposal also represented the end of Thompson Logistics as the family business I'd known for 12 years. Under her leadership structure, it would become a professionally managed company that happened to be owned by our family rather than a family business that maintained professional standards. I called Emma that evening to talk through the situation. She was now a senior in high school working on final college applications, but she'd grown up around Thompson Logistics and understood the family business dynamics better than most adults. Dad, can I ask you something? Do you want to be the COO of Thompson Logistics? The question caught me off guard. I've never really thought about titles, I just wanted to run operations effectively. That's not what I asked. Do you want to be the person making the strategic decisions about how the company grows and changes, or do you want to be the person implementing someone else's strategic decisions? When she put it that way, the answer was obvious. I'd spent 12 years building operational systems and making strategic decisions about how Thompson Logistics should develop. The idea of implementing Jessica's strategic vision, even in an important supporting role, felt like professional diminishment rather than career evolution. What do you think I should do? I think you should stop thinking about this as a family issue and start thinking about it as a career decision. If Aunt Jessica's plan is better for the company and if you'd be happier in a different role, then maybe the succession framework makes sense. But if you think you could lead the company's growth more effectively than she could, then you need to present your own strategic vision instead of just reacting to hers. Emma was right. Instead of responding defensively to Jessica's succession framework, I needed to develop my own proposal for Thompson Logistics' future direction. I needed to demonstrate that operational experience and relationship-based management could guide strategic growth as effectively as systematic planning and formal oversight. I spent the weekend developing what I decided to call a relationship-centered growth strategy for Thompson Logistics. Instead of focusing on systematic expansion into new geographic markets, I proposed deepening our relationships with existing clients and developing specialized services that leveraged our reputation for flexible, personalized logistics support. My analysis showed opportunities for growth that didn't require the kind of systematic scaling that Jessica's plan emphasized. Agricultural clients were increasingly looking for logistics partners who understood seasonal variations and could adapt quickly to harvest timing changes. Manufacturing clients valued reliability and communication more than formal compliance documentation. Regional businesses preferred working with companies that made decisions quickly and maintained consistent relationships over time. Thompson Logistics' competitive advantage wasn't systematic efficiency, it was adaptive flexibility and personal accountability. Clients chose us because they could call me directly when problems arose, because our drivers knew their operations personally, and because we made decisions based on long-term relationships rather than short-term profit optimization. My strategic framework proposed expanding these relationship-based advantages rather than replacing them with systematic processes. Instead of geographic expansion, we could develop deeper specialization in agricultural and manufacturing logistics. Instead of formal management hierarchies, we could create cross-functional teams that maintained personal accountability while sharing expertise. Instead of systematic compliance oversight, we could implement collaborative improvement processes that preserved operational flexibility. The financial projections for my approach were more conservative than Jessica's expansion scenarios, but they were also more sustainable and required less capital investment. More importantly, they preserved the family business culture that had been Thompson Logistics' foundation for 35 years. Monday morning, I requested a meeting with Dad to present my alternative strategic framework. He listened intently as I walked through my relationship-centered growth analysis, asking thoughtful questions about market opportunities and competitive positioning. "This is interesting, Marcus. Your approach focuses on different growth opportunities than Jessica identified, but the financial projections are compelling. The key difference is risk management," I explained. "Jessica's expansion strategy could generate higher revenues, but it also requires significant upfront investment and assumes that systematic management will be more effective than relationship-based approaches. My framework builds on proven strengths rather than betting on untested capabilities." Dad was quiet for several minutes after I finished the presentation. "You've given me a lot to think about. Both approaches have merit, but they represent fundamentally different directions for the company. What's your preference?" "Honestly, I'm not sure. Jessica's systematic approach addresses vulnerabilities that concern me, but your relationship-centered strategy aligns more closely with the culture we've built over 3 decades. The ideal solution might incorporate elements of both approaches. What would that look like?" "I think it means having a more detailed conversation with both of you about how your different strengths could complement each other in a combined strategic framework." That afternoon, Dad convened what he called a family business planning session with Jessica, myself, and Mom, who had been following the succession discussions with growing concern about family dynamics. "I've now heard strategic recommendations from both Marcus and Jessica," Dad began, "and I think we need to address some fundamental questions about Thompson Logistics' future direction and leadership structure." He outlined the key differences between Jessica's systematic expansion framework and my relationship-centered growth strategy, emphasizing the strengths and limitations of each approach. "The question isn't which plan is better," Dad continued. "The question is whether we can develop a combined approach that leverages both systematic management capabilities and relationship-based operational expertise." Jessica responded first. "I think integration is possible, but it requires clear role definitions and decision-making authority. Systematic planning and relationship management serve different functions, and they need to be coordinated rather than competing with each other." "I agree about coordination," I said, "but I think the coordination needs to preserve operational flexibility and personal accountability. Systematic processes can support relationship management, but they shouldn't replace the direct communication and quick decision-making that clients value." Mom, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "I think you're both missing the most important question. This business has supported our family and 47 employees for 35 years by treating people well and delivering reliable service. Any strategic plan needs to preserve those priorities regardless of whether it's systematic or relationship-centered." She was right, and her comment shifted the conversation away from competing methodologies toward shared values and priorities. We spent the next 2 hours developing what we eventually called a collaborative leadership framework for Thompson Logistics. Instead of choosing between systematic expansion and relationship-centered growth, we designed a structure that pursued both approaches through coordinated specialization. Jessica would lead market expansion initiatives, systematic compliance programs, and operational scaling projects. I would focus on client relationship management, specialized service development, and operational flexibility initiatives. We would collaborate on strategic decisions that affected both areas, with Dad maintaining final authority on major direction changes until he was ready to transition to an advisory role. The financial projections for the combined approach were stronger than either individual plan because systematic capabilities would enable expansion opportunities while relationship management would ensure client retention and service quality. More importantly, the collaborative framework preserved Thompson Logistics' family business culture while building capabilities for sustainable growth. 3 months later, we implemented the collaborative leadership structure with results that exceeded everyone's expectations. Jessica's systematic compliance programs enabled us to pursue contracts with larger clients who required formal documentation and regulatory certification. My relationship management approach helped us retain existing clients while developing specialized services that commanded premium pricing. The combination of systematic efficiency and personal accountability created competitive advantages that neither approach could achieve alone. Clients valued our ability to provide reliable compliance service through formal processes while maintaining the flexibility and communication that came from relationship-based management. Most importantly, the collaborative framework resolved the succession planning challenges without requiring anyone to subordinate their expertise to someone else's vision. Jessica and I had developed complementary roles that utilized our different strengths while working toward shared objectives for Thompson Logistics' growth and development. By the end of the year, we had increased revenue by 32%, expanded our client base by 40%, and maintained the employee satisfaction and safety standards that had always defined our company culture. The systematic improvements and relationship management approaches had reinforced each other rather than competing for priority. Standing in the warehouse on New Year's Eve, watching our night shift prepare for deliveries that represented the most successful year in Thompson Logistics history, I realized that the conflict between systematic management and relationship-based leadership had been a false choice. The real challenge had been figuring out how to integrate different approaches effectively rather than choosing between them. Jessica's systematic expertise had made Thompson Logistics more professionally managed and strategically focused. My operational experience had preserved the personal relationships and cultural values that made us different from larger competitors. Together, we had created something stronger than either approach could have achieved independently. The succession planning framework that had initially seemed like a threat to my position had evolved into an opportunity for collaborative leadership that leveraged both of our capabilities while preserving the family business identity that mattered most to all of us. 6 months later, Dad announced his gradual transition to an advisory role, with Jessica and me sharing operational authority through the collaborative leadership structure we'd developed. The announcement was met with enthusiasm from employees, clients, and industry partners who had observed our successful integration of systematic management and relationship-based approaches. Thompson Logistics had evolved from a traditional family business into something new, a professionally managed company that maintained family values, systematic capabilities that supported personal relationships, and collaborative leadership that preserved individual expertise while working toward shared objectives. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when family dynamics and professional disagreements had threatened to undermine the entire process. But by focusing on shared values and complementary strengths rather than competing methodologies, we had created a model for succession planning that preserved what mattered most while building capabilities for future growth. Looking back, I could see that Jessica's compliance initiative had never really been about undermining my operational authority. It had been about building systematic capabilities that Thompson Logistics needed to remain competitive while growing larger and more complex. My defensive reaction had been based on the assumption that systematic management and relationship-based leadership were incompatible approaches that required choosing between them. The collaborative framework had proven that assumption wrong. Systematic processes could support relationship management rather than replacing it. Formal compliance could coexist with operational flexibility. Professional management could preserve family business culture rather than transforming it into something unrecognizable. Most importantly, succession planning didn't have to be about one person inheriting complete authority from another. It could be about developing collaborative structures that preserved institutional knowledge while building new capabilities for changing market conditions. Thompson Logistics was still a family business, just one that had learned to integrate systematic management with relationship-based leadership in ways that strengthened both approaches. And that integration had created opportunities for growth and development that wouldn't have been possible with either approach alone. The lesson wasn't that systematic management was superior to relationship-based leadership or vice versa. The lesson was that the most effective organizations learn to combine different approaches in ways that leverage their respective strengths while addressing their individual limitations. Sometimes the best way to preserve what you value most is to let it grow into something bigger and more capable rather than protecting it from change that might actually make it stronger. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.